Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be an update on the protest led by Archbishop Bagrat Galstanyan. Then we're going to move on to what appears to be a peace offensive by the Baku regime. And lastly, some very interesting revelations that came out of a recent visit by the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko to his cohort dictator in Baku. During the last 10 days, the Bishop Galstanyan movement has sort of called off their public rallies. They've actually moved to far more specific actions, and a big one this week was in Vuskepar, the village that's closest to demarcation lines that are being demarked right now. There have been activities there for the past few days that led to the closing of the road and half a dozen different things. They've also been holding public meetings, different groups from different walks of life, from cultural groups to veterans organizations and the like. They've also been looking to find a prime minister candidate beyond the archbishop himself, who said he's willing to serve last week. And the name most mentioned is Arman Tatoyan, who's a former human rights ombudsman. So far, he has yet to publicly accept or reject the offer. They're also moving forward with holding another big rally, which was announced yesterday on May 26th, which is this weekend. In analyzing this movement this week, it's very clear that these efforts are sort of losing steam and getting less public attention. However, it's important for us to understand from the perspective of this government, this is sort of a shot across the bow at this government in regards to the public angst and anger about the security situation, especially at our borders. And it would be a mistake to see this movement as simply a play by old political hands like former President Kocharyan. The angst that has drove so many people into the street is actually shared by many more people than are actually showing up, no matter which political forces have been directing this movement. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is sort of the very open and easily perceived peace offensive by the regime in Baku. There's been a notable change in their rhetoric, talking about how peace is possible, along with the usual aggressive rhetoric, militarist rhetoric that they always use with threats that come with it. A lot of this is actually related to COP29, which is the UN Environmental Global Warming Summit that's going to be in Baku at the tail end of this year, speaking about making it into not just an environmental thing, but also a peace summit. And we obviously had the recent meeting between the foreign ministers of Armenia and the Baku regime in Almaty. If we want to analyze this, what does this really signify? In short, nothing. Azerbaijan has been getting beaten up over COP29 because it's sort of absurd for them to have it. And this is a regime that has hundreds of political prisoners and holding POWs illegally, and is actually an environmental mess holding this event. However, this event is actually quite important to the prestige of the regime. They actually live for things like this to give them, sort of a public vote of approval, which, they would otherwise have a hard time getting. I think the other thing is they're actually trying to dissuade us from actually going to the ICC to file genocide charges against them and war crimes charges. This is for war crimes in the 22 invasion of Armenia and in obviously the ethnic cleansing and genocide in Artsakh last year. But in reality, if we really want to know the truth, the regime is really buying time simply to be more aggressive next year. They're essentially waiting for two specific things. The first one is to see if Donald Trump wins the US presidential elections. Donald Trump actually, his family has had business relationship with the Aliyevs. And if nothing else, the chaos that he creates opportunities for despots like Aliyev to be far more aggressive in their attacks on their neighbors. And more importantly, I think he's waiting to see more about where the Russian advance in Ukraine is going, if who's going to win that war. Obviously, a Russian victory will embolden him to be far more aggressive next year. The only response to this from our end, frankly, is not to buy into it whatsoever. This is, in fact, the time to double down on pressing them and making them squeal like pigs on things like COP29 by getting people to boycott, not to go there, and all these efforts that are going on to pressure the regime on that. And obviously tie anything that's going on to releasing or illegally held POWs like Ruben Vartanyan in Baku. It's also very important to file charges, the ICC genocide charges now, and given this week what happened with the possible filings against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that actually makes Aliyev, who's a much smaller and less relevant fish, far more easy target for the ICC. We need to constantly press on that front, and obviously, most importantly, use the time frame to further advance and make our defenses stronger as we've been doing and enhance everything on that front for the next 6-7 months. Let's move on to the third and final topic of the week, which is some very interesting statements that were made by the Belarusian President Lukashenko while he was visiting the regime leaders in Baku.
Мы как братья общаемся, мы одинаково понимаем мир, понимаем, куда он движется. Вспомнил наш разговор перед войной еще, перед вашей освободительной войной, когда мы философски рассуждали за обедом вдвоем. Тогда мы пришли к выводу, что в войне победить можно. Потом надо, это важно, очень важно удержать эту победу. Но в-третьих, мы сошлись во мнении, вы тогда затронули этот вопрос, что после войны начнется самое тяжелое время, когда надо будет возрождать те земли. И вот как раз настало то тяжелое время, когда надо возрождать эти земли, надо возвращать людей, а они уже некоторые родились в городе, проблема, наверное, будет. Это большой труд, это за 5, а может и за 10 лет трудно это все выполнить. Поэтому, Александр Гедалевич, если мы в чем-то можем, помочь, участвовать в этом.
Now, Lukashenko is a clown for the most part. If you actually look at all of his statements and the way he acts. But in this case, he's actually quite a useful clown because of the things that he is publicly revealing that he actually shouldn't. Lukashenko is actually the closest world leader to Vladimir Putin. He's sort of his ilham to Putin's Erdogan. Let's not forget that when this conversation supposedly happened before the aggression against Artsakh, Armenia and Belarus were actually CSTO allies, so we're actually a treaty ally of Armenia. Here he is publicly admitting to having discussions about aggression against Armenia and Artsakh in 2020. This is confirming what we have always suspected, that the aggression was very likely green-lighted by Moscow, and obviously, from what we know, not opposed by the West. The reality is that even before Armenia's pivot away from Russia, Russia and her closest allies had pivoted away from Armenia. And reason for this was likely the 2018 revolution. The issue for them is not who came to power, but the need to attack any democratic movement that sets a very bad example for countries moving away from an oligarchic dictatorial system to having a free economy or generally honest and free elections. In conclusion, many of us are properly very critical of this government for all their mistakes and their general incompetence on matters that are critical to the state over the last 5 or 6 years. But we also need to understand that our foreign enemies do not oppose them for the mistakes that they have made or the mistakes that we criticize them for. They hate them for the number of things that they have actually done right. The truth is that this country, is subjected to continued hybrid warfare by the Russian state. Their arsenal stretches from their man in Baku to their operatives in Armenia. Their target is not this government, which is here today and gone tomorrow. Their target is to destroy our national sovereignty, and more importantly, to break our will to live as citizens and not as subjects. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.